The Vietnam War was one of the first truly televised wars. But even the violence projected into living rooms via TV screens couldn't capture the brutality of it all. From generals collecting body parts to undercover Viet Cong infiltrating embassies, here is some of what wasn't covered, some of the scariest secrets of the Vietnam War.
Robert Rowe might have been Francis Ford Coppola's inspiration for Colonel Kurtz, but Tony Poe might have been closer to the fictional deranged general. The stuff Poe did during the war would have made Brando's character sit up a bit straighter and say, "Really, man? That's a bit much." Anthony Pochepny, commonly known as Tony Poe, was a CIA operative who was involved in covert operations from the Vietnam War and the Laotian Civil War, a lesser-known war that lasted from 1959 to 1975 in Laos, right on the border of Vietnam. He worked in Laos as part of the CIA's Special Activities Division and conducted shadowy paramilitary and counterinsurgency activities against the communist regime, Pathet Lao, and their North Vietnamese allies. It's been said that Tony Poe engaged in some pretty brutal tactics during his operations in Laos. Some reports suggest that he paid bounties for the bodiless heads and ears of the members of the Pathet Lao, the communist guerrilla force that was fighting to overthrow the Laotian government. These tactics were part of a broader strategy to intimidate and demoralize the enemy. According to a biography of Poe written by a guy named John Prados, he even took these severed body parts and stapled some of them to his intelligence reports that he then sent back to the U.S. Embassy in Vientiane, the capital of Laos. Did he want the higher-ups to be all ears? It's unclear what effect Poe's grisly messages had, but it's clear that Poe was a little unhinged. Poe also allegedly dropped a few heads on a village that was accused of firing on his Air America aircraft. Air America was a CIA-owned airline that provided logistical support for covert operations in Southeast Asia. The airmail of the severed head was yet another shocking act aimed at punishing the village and deterring further attacks. Poe's time in the Laotian jungle was, on paper, supposed to only include training Laotian troops to fight against their communist enemies. But Poe went rogue a few times and led missions with unauthorized personnel against the Pathet Lao forces. Poe's secret army was totally off the books, and it's unclear the extent to which they fought. Poe was eventually extracted from Laos. By then, he had wed a Laotian woman. They would live in Thailand with their kids until 1990. While not one single person, there was some less than savory dynamics between soldiers and Vietnamese women during the war. Some of these women were called hooch maids, women who would be bused from villages into American camps to clean their barracks, which were nicknamed hooches after a loose pronunciation of the Vietnamese word for house. Being a hooch maid was actually quite lucrative relative to the income earned by an average Vietnamese person in the 60s and 70s. Hooch maids were considered upper middle class, and a lot of them earned around $60 a month, close to the monthly salary of a captain in the South Vietnamese Army. But not everything about the job was above board. There were plenty of stories of these maids being exploited and coerced by the soldiers, and a lot of them were known to keep the plumbing clean for the men during the war. Then there were the mamasans, or bar girls. Mamasans were local Vietnamese women who worked in bars and entertainment establishments near military bases. They were kind of like the short-term concubines of U.S. soldiers in Vietnam. They served drinks to American soldiers and offered companionship. Some of these mamasans entered into these relationships willingly, but others, not so much. The relationships between these women and the GIs were complex and often built on unequal power dynamics. The soldiers had access to financial resources and material comforts, while the mamasans were dependent on their clients for income and support. Some soldiers took advantage of this power imbalance to exert control over the women, leading to exploitive and abusive situations. The soldiers might offer gifts and financial assistance as a way to control and manipulate these women. And then there were the more obvious forms of exploitation. It's estimated that by the end of the war, there were as many as 500,000 women of the night across Vietnam. The next Vietnam-era doctor was less concerned with helping his patients' health and more concerned with how far he could push their minds towards insanity. Imagine going to a psychiatrist because you're depressed, and instead of therapy, he gives you a magic pill that has you permanently seeing Lucy in the sky with diamonds. James Ketchum was a U.S. Army officer and psychiatrist known for his involvement in the military's top-secret psychochemical warfare program during the Vietnam War. The program, officially known as the U.S. Army Chemical Corps' Edgewood Arsenal Program, was started in order to research and develop chemical agents that could be used to incapacitate the minds of adversaries without causing permanent physical harm. Ketchum kicked off his military career as a medical officer in the U.S. Army and later became a psychiatrist. In the early 1960s, he was assigned to work at the Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, where he became one of the key figures in the program researching psychochemical agents. The goal of the psychochemical warfare program was to explore the potential of non-lethal chemical agents for use in military operations. These agents, often referred to in more PR-friendly terms as calmatives or incapacitating agents, were intended to cause temporary disruptions in an enemy's cognitive and psychological functioning, leading to confusion and impaired decision-making. Sounds nice on paper with all the fancy lingo, but in reality, Ketchum and his team were basically just feeding drugs to unsuspecting victims and seeing what would happen. Ketchum carried out lots and lots of experiments on both military volunteers and unwitting subjects to test the effects of different psychochemical agents. Soldiers, often unaware of the true nature of the experiments, were exposed to substances such as LSD, BZ, and other hallucinogenic and mind-altering chemicals. Ketchum and his team evaluated the efforts of these substances on things like cognition and behavior, trying to understand their potentially military applications. The program also explored the possibility of using these chemicals for crowd control and other non-lethal military scenarios. BZ, for example, was developed as an aerosol that could potentially be sprayed or dropped as artillery shells or grenades over rowdy crowds or riots in order to confuse and disorient the participants. Known chemically as 3-quinaclinyl benzylate, BZ can have people seeing intense, incapacitating visions that last for days. Oh, I bet that was a lot of fun. Ketchum's psychochemical warfare program at Edgewood Arsenal remained highly classified, hidden from the public and even from many high-ranking military officials. But in the 1970s, as details of the program's experiments and ethical concerns came to light, investigations were launched, and hearings were held to examine what Ketchum and his psychosis-inducing team were up to. Critics raised serious ethical questions about the use of actual people in the experiments, people who were exposed to pretty heavy-duty chemicals that had long-lasting effects and could absolutely induce psychosis. The psychochemical warfare program at Edgewood Arsenal was eventually discontinued in the early 1970s. Ketchum continued his career as a psychiatrist, but without his fun chemical toys. I wonder what he prescribed instead. Maybe inhaling paint fumes to cure anxiety. On the morning of March 16, 1968, Lieutenant William Calley and his men dropped from helicopters into My Lai, a village near South Vietnam's east coast. Calley and his commanding officer, Captain Ernest Medina, had been told the landing zone in the village would be hot, packed with Viet Cong ready and waiting to attack. Instead, there was silence, and a village filled only with women and children. What happened next was one of the worst atrocities of the war. Calley's platoon proceeded to launch a brutal assault on the unarmed villagers, including people of all ages and gender. More than 500 civilians lost their lives, and many were subjected to horrific acts of violence and abuse before being killed. The incident was initially covered up by the military, but reports eventually surfaced, leading to public outrage and condemnation. In November 1969, journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story of what happened in My Lai, exposing the atrocities committed by U.S. soldiers. The revelation sparked widespread outrage and led to yet more protests against the war, protests that had picked up steam since the debacle of the Tet Offensive a year earlier. As the news of what happened in My Lai spread, investigations were launched, and Calley was charged with taking out 109 South Vietnamese civilians. Also charged was his commanding officer, Captain Ernest Medina, who reportedly ordered his men to destroy everything in the village. Charges against Medina were eventually dropped, but Calley? Nah, he wasn't that lucky. During Calley's trial, which began in November 1970, he claimed that he was following orders and believed the civilians of My Lai were enemy combatants. His defense team argued that he wasn't the only one responsible for the actions of his platoon, and that he was acting under pressure in a chaotic and confusing situation. But in March 1971, Calley was found guilty of taking the lives of 22 civilians and was sentenced to life in prison. His sentence was controversial, though. Some saw Calley as a scapegoat for the larger failures of the military command structure and questioned the fairness of singling him out for prosecution. In reality, Calley was definitely responsible for a lot of the carnage in My Lai, but so were about 20 others who were basically let off the hook, including Captain Medina. As a result of the public outcry and political pressures, Calley's sentence was reduced to 20 years by President Nixon. He served only 3.5 years under house arrest before being paroled in 1974. So now we got a guy who was a perpetrator of one of the most gruesome images captured during the Vietnam War, and a guy responsible for the brutal suppression of what's known as the Buddhist Uprising of 1966. Despite the peaceful image a lot of us have of Buddhists, the uprising in South Vietnam in the midst of the war was anything but peaceful. In 1966, General Nguyen Ngoc Loan was serving as the chief of the South Vietnamese National Police and was a close ally of Prime Minister Nguyen Cao Ky. During his time, South Vietnam was facing internal political and social challenges, including tensions between different military factions and religious groups. Nguyen Chan Thi, another high-ranking military officer who was part of Prime Minister Ky's inner circle, became jaded by certain decisions that were being made and wasn't too pleased with Ky's government. Thi was eventually booted from the inner circle, and from January 21st to March 2nd, he led an armed uprising in Hue, which was part of the broader political and military power struggle within South Vietnam. The uprising in Hue was disastrous. An estimated 5 to 10% of the city's entire population perished in the month of fighting. Many of those were civilians. All told, some 10,000 people lost their lives, making the events at Hue some of the bloodiest of the entire war. General Loan was responsible for suppressing the uprising in Hue. His forces successfully quelled the revolt, leading to the death of Nguyen Chan Thi's faction and further solidifying Ky's control. However, Loan's actions during the revolt weren't so savory, particularly in how he dealt with the Buddhist community. The suppression of Buddhist protests and demonstrations raised concerns about human rights abuses and political repression in South Vietnam. Then came the Tet Offensive in 1968. In a series of attacks during the Vietnamese New Year celebration, or Tet, Viet Cong soldiers disguised as civilians and South Vietnamese soldiers infiltrated army bases and strategic points across the South, including a brief takeover of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. The offensive was ultimately unsuccessful, but it was a major turning point in terms of public opinion. It had become clear that the U.S. and South Vietnamese were not winning the war, and the photo of Loan doling out his personal form of justice didn't help. Loan was captured on film executing a handcuffed and unarmed Viet Cong suspect named Nguyen Van Lim on a street in Saigon. Lim himself was reportedly no peach. He was accused of taking out the entire family of a South Vietnamese lieutenant, including his mother and 6 children. Still, the photograph of the execution, taken by photographer Eddie Adams, became one of the most horrifying and iconic of the entire Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was a debacle in many ways, and these men that we've talked about, while they were just cogs in a machine, still acted in ways that only made the war that much worse. Thanks for watching. What other creepy men from another time period do you want to know about? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more Nutty History.